Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
After my divorce 2 years ago, I decided to start fresh in a quiet community. The house prices were reasonable and the neighborhood looked peaceful. Little did I know I was walking into a mini dictatorship run by the president of our neighborhood association. The president was a middle-aged man who treated our community like his personal kingdom. At first, I tried to keep my head down and mind my own business. I had enough on my plate working from home as a software developer and trying to rebuild my life. But this guy made it impossible to stay neutral. It started with small things. He'd walk around the neighborhood with a notepad, writing down violations of community rules. One morning, I got a $200 fine because my trash bin was still out at 9:01 a.m. When I tried to explain that I had an important work call that morning, he just smirked. He coldly told me that rules were rules and everyone had to follow them. I pointed out how ridiculous it was to fine someone for being literally 1 minute late. He simply replied that I should have put it out earlier and demanded the $200 be paid by the end of the week. The irony? His own house was a mess. His fence was too tall according to city rules, and he had built a shed without proper permits. When other residents complained, he'd brush them off or threaten them with more fines. One day, I noticed something odd while walking my dog. The community pool was closed for the third time that month for maintenance, but I saw his kids swimming there. That's when I started paying attention to the neighborhood association's finances. Our annual fees were sky high compared to other neighborhoods, but our amenities were falling apart. The playground hadn't been repaired in months, and the landscaping looked terrible. During a community meeting, I asked if we could see a breakdown of how our fees were being spent. He dismissed my question, saying the budget was complicated and that he handled all the financial matters, so there was no need to worry about it. When I pressed further, pointing out that residents had a right to know, he suggested that if I didn't like how things were run, I was welcome to move somewhere else. That's when I decided to take action. I started talking to other residents, collecting stories and evidence. One elderly couple told me they were fined $500 for planting unauthorized flowers in their garden. A single mom was threatened with legal action because her kids were playing too loudly in their own backyard. I also discovered he was hiring his friend's company for all maintenance work, paying double the market rate. When I submitted a formal request for financial records, he ignored it for weeks. Finally, I gathered enough concerned residents to force an emergency community meeting. The meeting room was packed. The president walked in with his usual smug expression, but it didn't last long. He tried to start by announcing that recording the meeting wasn't allowed, but I cut him off. I told him that, according to state law, we had every right to record public meetings, and suggested he might want to sit down for what was coming next. I presented everything I had found: inflated invoices, mysterious payments to shell companies, and proof that he had been using community funds for personal expenses. The room erupted in anger. One resident demanded to know if he had used their money to build his patio. Another shouted about the constantly increasing fees. The president tried to defend himself, calling the accusations baseless and reminding everyone of his years of service to the community. I told him that the police and state attorney's office had already received copies of all the documentation that morning. His face turned white. He tried to leave, but residents blocked the door. Within weeks, he was removed from his position, and the police launched an investigation. They found he had stolen over $50,000 from our community funds. During the investigation, they discovered he had done the same thing in his previous neighborhood. He had moved here after being caught there, hoping to start fresh with a new group of victims. He ended up facing criminal charges and had to sell his house to pay restitution. I heard he tried to join another neighborhood association in the next town, but his reputation preceded him. Someone had created a website documenting his schemes, and it showed up every time someone searched his name. Now our neighborhood is run by a proper board with transparent finances and fair rules. Our fees are lower, our amenities are maintained, and people actually enjoy living here. I'm a fantasy novelist who struck gold with my first series about a group of teenage outcasts discovering they have the ability to communicate with ancient spirits. The books really took off after the second installment, and now I'm 4 books deep into what's planned to be a 6-book series. The success changed my life dramatically. From a high school English teacher writing in my spare time to a full-time author with security detail at public events. Yesterday's signing was at a major bookstore in the downtown area. My bodyguard, a former Marine who's been with me for the past year, was standing nearby as usual. Everything was going smoothly for the first 2 hours. Fans were excited but respectful, sharing how the books helped them through tough times or inspired them to start writing themselves. Then she showed up. The woman, let's call her Karen, barged to the front of the line dragging a kid who looked around 12 or 13 behind her. The poor boy seemed mortified. She immediately started announcing that it was her son's birthday and that he was a huge fan. I responded politely, offering to sign their book and take a quick photo with them. But that wasn't enough for Karen. She declared that I would be coming with them to their house. When I asked her what she meant, she explained that they were having a birthday party and I was meant to be the surprise guest. She said she had promised her son that I would spend the day with him since he talked about my books nonstop. I tried to explain that this was impossible, mentioning the hundreds of people waiting in line and my 3-hour commitment to the signing. Karen insisted that everyone else could wait or come back another day, saying she had promised this to her son. The boy tried to intervene, clearly embarrassed by his mother's behavior, but she immediately shut him down and told him to be quiet while she handled the situation. I apologized again and stated that I couldn't leave, explaining my commitments to the bookstore and other fans. Karen then tried to intimidate me by bringing up her husband's status as an important businessman, offering to pay whatever amount I wanted. When I explained that this wasn't about money and that I simply couldn't abandon my scheduled appearance, things took a physical turn. She reached across the table and grabbed my arm, attempting to physically pull me from my chair. My bodyguard stepped in immediately, but Karen began swinging her purse at him while maintaining her grip on my arm. My bodyguard warned her to release me or he would have to restrain her. Karen responded with more aggression, ranting about trying to make her son's birthday special and refusing to be stopped. When she attempted to bite my bodyguard as he moved to separate us, he performed what he later called a controlled takedown. Within seconds, she was face down on the floor, with my bodyguard using his knee to keep her in place while calling the police. She began screaming about being assaulted and demanding that people film the incident. The bookstore security arrived quickly, followed by the police. Throughout this chaos, her son stood by, clearly mortified. He quietly apologized, saying he had told his mother this was a bad idea. I assured him that none of this was his fault. The police took statements from everyone, including several witnesses who had recorded the incident. When they ran her information, they found an outstanding warrant for assault from a different incident at a makeup store, where she tried to force a beauty influencer to do her daughter's makeup for prom. She was arrested immediately. The bookstore staff helped restore order, and I made sure to sign a book for her son before he left with his father, who had been called to pick him up. The poor kid deserved something positive from this disaster. The signing continued and the rest of the day went well. Several people in line showed me their recordings of the incident, mentioning it was already trending on social media. My publisher later called to check on me and mentioned they were receiving interview requests about the incident. I learned this morning that Karen is being charged with assault, attempted kidnapping, and resisting arrest. She's also been served with a restraining order that prevents her from attending any of my future events. Her husband called my publisher to apologize and revealed they're in the middle of divorce proceedings. Apparently, this was the last straw for him. I've decided to continue doing public appearances and book signings. I won't let one entitled parent ruin the joy I get from meeting genuine fans. Plus, my bodyguard says this was actually one of the tamer incidents in his career, which is both reassuring and terrifying at the same time. When I turned 16 in 1995, I immediately started job hunting. After a few weeks of searching, I landed my first job at Circuit City. I was over the moon, not only because it was my first real job, but also because I was genuinely interested in electronics. The employee discount didn't hurt either, especially since I was saving up for my own stereo system. The first few months went smoothly. I learned the ropes quickly, memorized where everything was located, and actually enjoyed helping customers find what they needed. My co-workers were decent people too, except for our store manager. He had this way of making everyone feel small, but since he usually stayed in his office, we didn't have to deal with him much. Then came the holiday season. The store was constantly busy, and prices were changing almost daily. Someone would go around every morning putting up new price tags, trying to keep up with all the holiday sales and promotions. One day, about 2 weeks before Christmas, a middle-aged couple approached me while I was organizing the speaker section. The husband politely asked for help with the speakers. When I offered my assistance, his wife explained that they were interested in a particular model, but something seemed off about the price tag. I looked at the tag they were pointing at. It read $1.99 for a high-end speaker that I knew should be much more expensive. I told them I would scan it to check the actual price. When I did, to my surprise, it actually rang up as $1.99. The couple exchanged looks, and the husband pointed out that these speakers were usually around $200. I agreed with him and explained that there might have been a mistake with the decimal point. I told them I would get my manager to sort this out. I found my manager in his office and explained the situation. He stormed out, following me back to the speaker aisle where the couple was waiting patiently. He demanded to know what the problem was. When I showed him the price tag and explained how it was scanning, his face turned red, and suddenly he exploded. He started screaming at me, asking if I was stupid and couldn't tell the difference between $1.99 and $199. He kept jabbing his finger in my face, spittle flying from his mouth as he continued berating me in front of everyone. The couple looked horrified, and the wife tried to defend me, saying it wasn't my fault since they were the ones who brought it to my attention. The manager just snapped at her to stay out of it, saying this was between him and his incompetent employee. The couple quickly left the store, and I spent the rest of my shift being berated by the manager every time he saw me. He kept making comments about my intelligence and how I was lucky to even have this job. I went home that day fighting back tears, dreading my next shift. The following days were awful. I could barely sleep, worried about losing my job right before Christmas when I had already bought presents using my employee discount. 3 days later, I came in for my shift and was immediately called to the manager's office. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But when I walked in, I saw another person there, a manager from a different Circuit City location. The visiting manager explained that the couple had contacted the corporate office about my manager's behavior. They had described in detail how he had screamed at a teenage employee over a pricing error that wasn't even her fault. My manager was forced to apologize to me, red-faced and clearly angry about having to do so. After his half-hearted apology, he was asked to leave the office. The visiting manager assured me that this behavior was completely unacceptable in their company and told me that my manager had been terminated effective immediately. She explained that the couple had written a lengthy complaint, describing not only the incident, but also pointing out how inappropriate it was for a grown man to berate a teenage employee in such a manner. They had apparently threatened to contact local news stations about how Circuit City managers treat young employees. The corporate office had investigated and found other complaints about his behavior from both customers and employees who had been too afraid to speak up. In the end, it wasn't just this one incident that got him fired. It was the final straw in a long history of abusive behavior. I continued working at Circuit City until I left for college 2 years later and never had another problem with management. The new store manager was actually a decent person who treated everyone with respect. My wife and I have been married for 10 years now. She's a stay-at-home mom to our 2 beautiful children, and I work in tech. We live in New York, but that's not where our story begins. It starts in Kentucky, where my wife grew up in what I can only describe as a nightmare. Her mother was, and still is, a piece of work. A drug addict who cared more about her next fix than feeding her own children. My wife would often go to school hungry, wearing the same clothes for days. When she was home, she'd have to deal with her mother's violent mood swings, verbal abuse, and occasional physical altercations. The woman would spend whatever money they had on drugs, leaving nothing for basic necessities. I remember my wife telling me about one particular incident that perfectly captured her childhood. She had approached her mother about needing new shoes for school because her old ones had holes in them. Her mother immediately got defensive and aggressive, accusing her of being too rough with her shoes and wasting money. When my wife tried to explain that the shoes were 3 years old, her mother threatened her and told her to get out of her sight before she gave her something to really cry about. That was a typical interaction in their household. When my wife turned 19, she'd had enough. We were already dating then, and with my help, she managed to escape. We moved several states away to New York, got married, and started building our life together. Her mother tried to manipulate her way back in multiple times, but we stood our ground. A few years ago, she attempted to use grandparents' rights to force contact with our children. That failed miserably, especially since she'd never even met them. Just last week, we received a letter in the mail. My wife's hands were shaking as she opened it. In the letter, her mother had the audacity to guilt-trip my wife about abandoning her and demanded to move in with us. She cited Kentucky's filial responsibility laws, which she had helpfully attached, and declared that she would be moving in within the month. She even mentioned that she had already started packing. My wife was terrified. The thought of her mother moving in with us, near our children, sent her into a panic attack. I immediately started researching and discovered that these laws likely wouldn't apply to us, especially since we live in New York, which doesn't have filial responsibility laws. I reached out to a lawyer friend while waiting for an official appointment. When I explained our situation about the mother-in-law threatening us with Kentucky's filial responsibility laws, he quickly put our minds at ease. He explained that these laws rarely cross state lines, and given the documented history of abuse and the fact that my wife cut contact before she was even 20, no court would force her to support her mother. He also mentioned that if my mother-in-law was on Medicaid, which she likely was, that would further protect us from any claims. Armed with this information, I wrote back to her. The letter was firm and clear, stating that we wouldn't tolerate her attempts to manipulate and frighten her daughter with misrepresented legal information. I told her that we had consulted with legal counsel and were prepared to take action if she continued these harassment tactics. I concluded by telling her that any further communication should be directed to our lawyer. We also included a cease and desist letter from our lawyer friend, along with documentation of her past abuse, the failed grandparents' rights case, and her history of drug use. We made it clear that any further attempts to contact us would result in legal action. The response? Complete silence. It's been 3 weeks now, and we haven't heard a peep from her. My wife is finally sleeping better, knowing that her mother's threats were just that, empty threats from a desperate, entitled woman who lost her power over her daughter long ago. We've since installed security cameras around our house, just in case she gets any ideas about showing up uninvited. But somehow I don't think she will. Bullies like her tend to back down when their victims show strength. And my wife? She's stronger than ever. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.